It's been 11 days since Hurricane Ian, a Category 4 monster of a storm, cut across central Florida. Even in a state that's no stranger to hurricanes, the destruction in the wake of Ian is staggering. More than 100 deaths, most by drowning, communities in tatters. The price tag for recovery, estimated at more than $100 billion. We went to ground zero on Florida's southwest coast, where Ian first roared ashore and where the hurricane's fury was most severe.
Not long ago, Hurricane Ian destroyed this bridge crossing in Florida at the end of September 2022. It's a tiny microcosm of billions in damages and hundreds of lives destroyed, and while the mass media is happy to cover an event in the moment, they rarely linger when they can move on to the next natural disaster. And knowing the typical bureaucratic government response to storms like these, no one expected much to happen here for months, if not years. Hopelessness begins to seep in.
The family went back to see what was left of the place they had called home for almost 20 years.
Where are we? I can't even tell.
Ian severed the causeway that connects Sanibel to the mainland, so the Spreckers returned by boat.
You wouldn't even know this is... home.
I've always wondered why Peter Jackson wrote in the parallel between Boromir and the Witch King's line, "The world of men will fall." Boromir says his at the moment of his death, when the hopelessness he feels knowing Sauron's strength and the inability of Gondor to withstand it is fully voiced.
The world of men will fall, and all will come to darkness, and my city to ruin.
While the Witch King's, in contrast, is said at a moment of victory, which he describes as his hour.
This is my hour. The world of men will fall.
But why do they say the world of men? And why is the Witch King's delivery of his line so important right before the Rohirrim come to Gondor? First, the line itself has to be addressed. In the Fellowship of the Ring book, the implication is different. The line is actually Saruman's line. It isn't phrased the same way. He says, "The time of the elves is over, but our time is at hand. The world of men which we must rule." So this reveals Saruman's corruption, for he is espousing not his own point of view, but Sauron's desire for order and control, and to achieve such a goal, Sauron needed to defeat anyone who wouldn't submit to his singular rule. But if a nation would willingly serve, he wasn't about to expend the time and energy destroying them, because destruction just breeds chaos. It doesn't breed order, which is his primary goal. From what we see of the Haradrim and the Easterlings under Sauron's dominion, they appear to be quite orderly, well-trained, committed, and outside the faithful, those who descended from the western nations of Middle-earth, we see that the rest of realms of men have been under the sway of Sauron for quite some time. In fact, for generations.
Pelennor began to set themselves up as lords in Middle-earth and demanded tributes in goods and wealth from other lands, causing the oppression of the Haradrim. Under the leadership Alpharazon, the Númenóreans made war on the other men of Middle-earth, often enslaving the Haradrim and using them for human sacrifices.
And that, combined with the long history of war between Gondor, the blood feuds, and the like, is a large part of why they came to the fight for Sauron against Gondor. This is not really delved into at all in the films, but this is a really important crux to understand the differences between the worlds of men. When we say the world of men, many different groups of men. So Saruman's line is referring to all men, the ones already under Sauron's dominion and those not. So when we first hear the line from Boromir in the first film, and then proceed to see the wild men with Saruman and the Haradrim and the Easterlings all in the Two Towers, and then we see the Corsairs with their boats and ships coming in Return of the King, you'd be rightfully confused to ask, why is this line, why does it exist at all in the trilogy? There are way more men working with Sauron, or appear to be, than are with Gondor and Rohan. What is with this world of men will fall? So I think the issue is the films that the world of men will fall is not referencing all men. It's actually the world of free men who seek to live and be ruled by their own. The monarchic and often tribal societies of ancient Europe are reflected in how J.R.R. Tolkien set up Gondor and Rohan to be presented. And this is an unnatural state of men in the world of Middle-earth, because we know, through the Silmarillion and other sources, the appendices and so on, that men have served a dark god, a tyrant, a dictator, even one not of their own kind, way before even Númenor was settled.
Evolve the idea that you and I have within ourselves the God-given right and the ability to determine our own destiny. But freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
So the point of the line, the book or film, is that men's spirit of hope, of self-determinism, of a freedom to govern their own, needs to be crushed. And Sauron has been doing the subversion game a long time. He knows that if he can use psychological warfare, he can win the fight before it begins, by attacking the spirit of optimism that's necessary to have hope. Was it Saruman's idea to cloud Theoden's mind and subvert via Wormtongue? Well, we know that Sauron did the same thing with Denethor and Gondor long before. Sauron has many other tricks he uses throughout the films and the books, that we see that he builds hopelessness and despair ahead of any actual warfare. The black clouds of ash that blot out the sun, the constant rating and pressure from different numbers to build uncertainty and manipulation of leadership via the Palantir. Something Tolkien doesn't get enough credit for is that of all his imitators throughout the decades, he is actually one of the darker high fantasy writers. He builds slow, subtle, creeping hopelessness, incredible pathos even in his side characters. And the catharsis of moments of triumph, such as the charge to the Pelennor field, that we'll have to talk about soon, they only work as such powerful highs because of the tension and depth of despair in the lows that Tolkien weaves into his world. We see two reactions to Sauron's effort in the first half of Lord of the Rings. We see Boromir, who's representing Gondor, and Theoden, who's representing Rohan. And both of these are deeply flawed men who have been hammered by a constant state of war and a creeping doubt that they are the weakened link at the end of an ancestral chain. And what permeates both their stories, their fears and their doubts, is this constant undercurrent that they are not up for the task and that there is no hope left. In a fight to the death, they cannot win. Boromir, the toll of constant war and his easy corruption by the ring, and Theoden, the loss of his son and the corruption by Saruman. I've always thought that these men are far more relatable than Aragorn, and they represent a universal fascination, as Tolkien himself describes the allure of death.
When it comes down to any large story, it interests people, can hold them attention for a considerable time, or make stories, practically always, a human story is practically always about one thing, aren't they? Death. The inevitability of death. There is no such thing as a natural death. Nothing that happens to man is ever natural, since his presence calls the whole world into question. All men must die, but for every man his death is an accident, and even if he knows it and consents to it, an unjustifiable violation.
We never feel it is hopeless reading the books or watching the films. And that denial in the face of inevitability is the powerful contradiction that makes us human. So why don't we feel hopelessness when we read or watch Tolkien? I think there's something to be learned by some of the nuanced differences in how creating hope, rather than wishing for it, is what leads to this outcome. Stick with me here. Let's start with Boromir. In Fellowship of the Ring, the film, Boromir is established as a dutiful servant of Gondor. He's a battle-weary warrior. He's fed up with the lords of the land keeping it safe while he's on the frontier fighting. He's a doubter of Aragorn, but he's also someone with honorable thoughts, but somewhat misguided desires for the ring. He's dismissive, he's weathered, he's prickly, he's even a bit defeatist when the scale of the task is laid out at the Council of Elrond. He can't see a path forward that doesn't involve seizing external power, the ring, regardless of its self-destructive properties. A man anxious and desperate who will reach out to a powerful substance to give him an illusion of power so he can take the next step today but without considering the costs, this is a stepping stone for even a good man into a path of darkness. This is also not his natural state. We see his core personality in quieter moments. For example, he teaches Merry and Pippin to fight through encouragement and lighthearted instruction.
2, 1, 5. Good. Very good. Move your feet. That's good, Pippin.
Thanks.
Faster. Sorry.
Get him! There you shot him! Hold him! Hold him there, May!
Never mind, that's enough.
In fact, he's horrified when he accidentally hurts Pippin because his intention is to teach, not to humiliate or discourage them. He's absolutely joyous when the hobbits gang up, shrug off their failure, and tackle him. And this tells us so much about Boromir, even though he's a defeatist about the larger mission, partly as a result of his father's influence, himself influenced by Sauron and via the Palantir. Boromir takes the initiative as the leader and as someone who recognizes where the party needs help, and he knows how to help level them up without making them feel small. He also builds bonds with them that he knows will make the overall group stronger. He's not sitting around moping, he's not pushing them off and ignoring them as inconsequential as some of the others do, but he takes the small steps he can to build up those around him, particularly the weakest of the party. Now, when the Fellowship is fleeing the Balrog and the staircase is collapsing, you actually see that he grabs Merry and Pippin, and without a word, he leaps them to safety. Again, he's establishing his protectorate relationship with them and his defense of the weakest of the party. And this is important because we see that this is after Legolas jumps and even Gandalf jumps alone. And all through the details and interactions that involve little dialogue, it shows through his actions who he is at his core. Now, after Gandalf falls, Boromir pleads with Aragorn to stay and give the hobbits time to grieve. He is part of this fellowship. He is a bond with the hobbits and others that goes beyond mere duty to the company. And it shows Boromir that while he's a good leader, he also thinks as much with his heart as his head. Aragorn is more pragmatic, and in a way he's more ruthless, some of that from experience, as well as his personal disconnect from some of the conflicts that are going on in the wider world. Both display a different sort of strength, but the situation calls for one over the other at the moment. So Boromir, we see here that he bows to Aragorn, and he attempts a similar plea with Aragorn later on, finally sharing his inner doubts and desires and thinking. This is the moment when Boromir's internal doubts crack. He can envision a hope. His current despair is grounded through his past experience and his lens of his father's expectations. So then Boromir falls to the ring, and his moment of weakness destroys him. His first words to Aragorn while he lies dying is to alert him the Uruk-hai have Merry and Pippin. His second statement is a confession that he tried to take the ring. And then, before he dies, in his last breath, he accepts Aragorn as his king. Because Boromir really only wanted power to protect his people. And now he sees that certainly he couldn't find it himself, but that might exist in Aragorn. He knows saying words will help Aragorn be a stronger leader going forward, and that gives him a closure he needs, at least again in the film.
Residents of Florida's Sanibel Island are still assessing damages done to their homes during Hurricane Ian, and the local government there has begun the recovery process.
All right, let's first ask about this bridge, obviously the main thoroughfare in and out by land at least. How is the construction going? Has it started? And when do we expect this to reopen?
It has started. I was with the governor on Wednesday, and he said, let us know that that bridge, that temporary bridge, would be finished by the end of this month, October. And if you look at the pictures, you know what a Herculean task that is. They started in the middle of the night. They've been running 24 hours, and the progress they have made is incredible. And we are a pretty sturdy bunch, and I know that we're going to rebuild this island and have the opportunity to have the world watch us rebuild this island better than it ever was.
Unlike Boromir, Theoden does not have the temptation of the ring dangling in front of him. He sees no external power option, and while initially his mind is twisted by Saruman's sorcery and persuasion, when he wakes up to find that his kingdom is already overrun and his son is dead, and there's no one coming to save him, and the enemies are at the gates. I personally find Theoden's arc, while in some ways similar, it's even more pronounced and dynamic than Boromir's because Boromir's is more of a static arc. He doesn't truly change. He is not a dramatically different man from when we first meet him to when he dies at the end of Fellowship. Theoden, though, goes through a three-part arc. First, Theoden is corrupted by Saruman, and as Sun Tzu says, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Saruman succeeds. In this case, Rohan has been paralyzed. Tyrants have always known that control of the mind with words is often as, if not more powerful than the threat of force. And if a tyrant wants to follow Sun Tzu, the best form of attack is to make a man feel it's impossible to fight back through even a small action. Tolkien himself recognized this feeling with Theoden's own internal thoughts, which we'll get to shortly. Feeling helplessness leads to hopelessness over time, which in turn leads to a lack of motivation to do things to improve oneself. What's the point, after all? Theoden's waking up is very much like this, and when he realizes that the wall has been pulled over his eyes, this is the first step, but it's not in fact the most important step to shifting from hopelessness to action. This is where we get to the second part of his arc. What happens? Gandalf comes in, Theoden reclaims his independence, but at this point, it appears that things are hopeless around him from an external point of view. He realizes that in his corrupted state, he has failed in his duties to provide, protect, and lead his people. The nation's in flames, people under attack, morale is low, invaders are approaching, and when he hears about Saruman's successes, his instinct shifts immediately to flee and hide. When Theoden prophetically tells Aragorn that
Rohan's crops are villages, they come to destroy his people, down to the last child.
What would you have me do? Look at my men. Their courage hangs by a thread.
Is it his men's courage or his own? We see him rally his people, but the constant barrage of negative news generates fear and a fight-or-flight reaction. This builds an ever-present anxiety into a society, and also a sense of helplessness, that the issues are so impossibly large, corrupted, that there's nothing you can do about it. And this is why, to break a paralysis like this, you need to stop being involved with the negative stream, such as when Theoden, his corruption is broken. Get up, take hold of your will, which is what Theoden finally does when he decides he's going to make a decision and lead his people to Helm's Deep. Hell or high water, whether it's the right or wrong decision, he's going to make a decision and do something. And the third part of his arc, the most important step to breaking out of a constructed, hopeless situation, is the move to take action to change something. When Theoden chooses to ride out of Helm's Deep, this is at the nadir where his hope is extinguished. Aragorn is the one who advises him to take action, even a seemingly hopeless action, and Theoden agrees. And this is choice was not Aragorn's to make, regardless of what would have been its outcome, had Gandalf not appeared on the field of battle. It's a pivotal point where Theoden shifts from flight to fight. His final decision, the pivotal moments of his character on the Pelennor field, is a carry-through of this first point of action. To summarize, Theoden had 3 core arcs to his story. He's representing the lower lords, the more common man, something Tolkien leans into with the hobbits particularly, but something we don't think about as much with the differences between the races or groups of men. In contrast to the glorious armored soldiers and monolith of Gondor, Rohan are farmers, they're horse traders. Their king's palace, Metal said, is modeled after the Viking halls. Their garments are rugged. Theoden, whose line is broken with the death of his son, is a man defiant. It's a refusal in the face of crippling odds. This stubbornness is not a consistency given how much doubt we see in him, but it's core to his character. Let's listen to Tolkien deliver the moment from the book.
Now silently the host of Rohan moved forward into the field of Gondor, pouring in slowly but steadily like the rising tide through breaches in a dike that men have thought secure. A smell of burning was in the air and a very shadow of death. The horses were uneasy, but the king sat upon Snowmane, motionless, gazing upon the agony of Minas Tirith, as if stricken suddenly by anguish or by dread. He seemed to shrink down, cowed by age. Merry himself felt as if a great weight of horror and doubt had settled on him. His heart beat slowly. Time seemed poised in uncertainty. They were too late. Too late was worse than never. Perhaps Theoden would quail, bow his old head, turn, slink away to hide in the hills. Then suddenly Merry felt it at last, beyond doubt, a change. Wind was in his face. Light was glimmering. Far, far away in the south the clouds could be dimly seen as remote grey shapes rolling up, drifting. Morning lay beyond them. But at that same moment there was a flash, as if lightning had sprung from the earth beneath the city. For a searing second it stood dazzling far off in black and white, its topmost tower like a glittering needle. And then as the darkness closed again, there came rolling over the fields a great boom. At that sound the bent shape of the king sprang suddenly erect. Tall and proud he seemed again, and rising in his stirrups he cried in a loud voice more clear than any there had ever heard a mortal man achieve before, "Arise, arise, riders of Theoden! Fell deeds await fire and slaughter. Spear shall be shaken, shield be splintered, sword day, red day ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride to Gondor!" With that he seized a great horn from Guzlach, his banner-bearer, and he blew such a blast upon it that it burst asunder. And straightway all the horns in the host were lifted up in music, and the blowing of the horns of Rohan in that hour was like a storm upon the plain, and a thunder in the mountains. Ride now, ride to Gondor! Suddenly the king cried to Snowmane, and the horse sprang away. Behind him his banner blew in the wind, white horse on a field of green, but he outpaced it. After him thundered the knights of his house, but he was ever before them. Eomer rode there, the white horse tail on his helm, floating in his speed. On the front of the first Eored roared like a breaker foaming to the shore, but Theoden could not be overtaken. Fey he seemed, or the battle fury of his fathers ran like new fire in his veins. And he was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, even as Oromir the Great in the battle of the Valar when the world was young. His golden shield was uncovered, and lo, it shone like an image of the sun, and the grass flamed into green above the white feet of his steed. For morning came, morning in a wind from the sea, and darkness was removed, and the hosts of Mordor wailed, and the terror overtook them, and they fled and died, and the hoofs of wrath rode over them. And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, and they sang as they slew, for the joy of battle was on them, and the sound of their singing that was fair and terrible came even to the city.
See, he makes a choice. He commits. I actually prefer the book's choice to use the word ride now, ride to Gondor, versus death as the final charge. The movie's, it's almost too much on the nose. He's declaring a choice and encouraging others to follow him, and the subtext that death is inevitable, or seemingly inevitable, is background to the much more important choice, the choice to face inevitability fearlessly and without flinching, to take that small action. It requires an acceptance that death is inevitable. Once you accept that you will die eventually, you can work back to, if I'm going to die anyway, what can I do to make a difference now, today? The universality, the staying power of this scene is married against in cinema the most epic horse charge into certain death. All hinges on this choice by Theoden. He's the weakest man in a link of history. He makes the choice to take action, to do what he can do in spite of his fear and doubt. And when he goes to the halls of his fathers, in whose mighty company he will not feel ashamed, it's because he chose to do something. He chose not to give up. And that is the spirit that pushes back against a tyrant like Sauron's rule.
Major progress to report today in getting the Sanibel Causeway back up and running after Hurricane Ian. This is what it looked like when Action Air 1 flew over the island less than 2 weeks ago. You can see parts of the bridge underwater. The only way that anyone could get onto the island was by boat. Well, now we've got these new images coming in from FDOT today. Here they are showing the work that has been done there so far. Governor DeSantis tells us a convoy of first responders as well as utility workers will drive across the causeway today. It's expected to be open to the public, and the timetable they're giving us is by October 21st.
I've been sprinkling this in throughout. This is the final point. How many of you have heard of this miraculous story? How many news outlets have showcased the incredible power of people who refuse to see the impossible and to take those small incremental steps to do something that everyone says cannot be done? And I think we learn from Theoden's choice. We all feel helpless and desperate at some point in our lives. And much like Sauron's psychological warfare, this is not an accident. It's a planned effort through a broader communication at a scale Tolkien couldn't have dreamed of, but is already aware of in his own day. And this is why distancing oneself from television programming of news media is, for most people, it's that first step to lifting the veil and seeing a positive in the world around them. Our leaders don't need you to die. They need you to live as one dead, an enslaved subject. And whether through social programming, through debt, through self-doubt, the chains appear invisible as we're cloaked behind a veil in many forms. And yet they all say the same message, which is that you cannot do it. You cannot take an action to change for the better. Don't be stubborn, don't rock the boat. The story of your enslavement, you're a cog in the machine, is secured when you accept that message from the programming around you. Tolkien was a man opposed to the machine and to the conformity and monoculture of a tyrannical control, and I think there's a reason his timeless message resonates so clearly today, decades even after the films have come out. How can we choose to take action in the face of such odds in our own world? My son recently asked me what being brave means. What I told him was that bravery is accepting that you're scared, even terrified of doing something, and yet choosing to do something anyway. And as a man and a father, when I'm filled with doubt, I turn to what I know I can do. Do something, and then build on that, even if it's a small win. The framework an old business client of mine showed me looked something like this. The lie of some of the global movements, such as the war on drugs and the war on poverty, is that it creates a fear that's so great and yet so distant, one is paralyzed on how to actually do something that will truly make an impact. This leads to emotional and psychological overload. For example, the war on hunger. Many people will donate $1 or $5 to fight hunger in a foreign country, pat themselves on the back, close their browser, and do nothing about the homeless man on the street corner, or the family about to be evicted next door, or the family member struggling with loneliness and anxiety who's only one phone call away. The messaging of these broader movements is designed to remove your personal agency from acting on what's happening directly around you in the real world. They play on your dreams so you forget to live.
It's what we want. Whatever we want.
Yes. And no. It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest and most desperate desires of our hearts. This mirror gives us neither knowledge or truth. Men have wasted away in front of it, even gone mad. It does not do to dwell on dreams, Harry, and forget to live.
The catalyst of personal change is then the decision to do something better than you're doing today, right now. And like Theoden, it can feel we're the weakest link in a chain of generations. Lying while dying in the Pelennor fields, Theoden finally admits to himself that having stood up against tyranny, against the darkness, he can go to his fathers unashamed.
Level imagery. Somebody can click in and see what that house looks like from the front after the storm.
So you've got the whole event,
before, after ground level.
That's correct.
After posting some of his work on social media, he was inundated with requests. So that huge circle that we saw, you're going down every cul-de-sac, going up and down, getting pictures on both sides of the street?
Every road, every house.
How long did that take you?
Took me 9 hours, 117 miles.
And how many pictures did you end up with?
Just over 8,000.
Why'd you do this?
If you've ever felt hopelessness or despair or the anxiety that comes with the unknown, you know it's a terrible feeling. We know that we can use technology in a way that really hasn't been used before to get to the right audience, to get to the loved ones and family members. We want to quell that anxiety for them.
Western civilization and its message of freedom and tolerance and self-governance inevitably will fall if we as individuals give in to hopelessness.
I can't just let you break this down. I mean, it'd be sacrilege.
And if we take that action, that seemingly inconsequential, seemingly small action, it is that action which will change the course of the world.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil.